Hi there, I'm Jen, this is Remembered Reads, and this is going to be my wrap-up for January the 9th through January the 19th. The first thing that I read during that period was Arthur Miller's play Incident at Vichy, which is a short little play. Productions of this do not need an intermission. Frankly, they need filler to make this long enough that people feel they got their money's worth most of the time, I think. You know, when the Soul Pepper Theatre in Toronto did it, the director was describing it as using the Holocaust as a metaphor for human nature, which I found a little eyebrow-raising because that's not something you hear every day. But yeah, I read it and that struck me as being about as good a description as any. Set in France in 1942, and there are 9 people who are being interrogated. They have to wait inside a police station, so they're talking to each other, and effectively, are they defending their own humanity? Maybe. Who lives? Who dies? Maybe you'll not find out. There are no answers to that, because it's about that moment where they're sitting in the room being stressed, wondering if they're going, you know, one direction or the other. Are they going free? Are they going to a death camp? Are they going to prison? And it's about the stress. The claustrophobia is what it says on the back, but it felt like it was more about stress than claustrophobia to me. But in any case, it is super short, so if you're even mildly curious about it, it takes, you know, half an hour to read, so. I personally didn't find it particularly memorable, but I was glad that I read it because it's been referenced a lot of places, so I guess I would say that I appreciated this more than I liked it. But I was glad that I read it, in any case. And the next thing I read I had a similarly middle-of-the-road kind of reaction to. This is Deborah Levy's The Unloved, which I think was her first novel. And it is about a group of tourists who are staying at a bed and breakfast style French castle, and the back of the book says a woman is brutally murdered, but really a woman is found dead. And it is somewhat about flashbacks looking at what was happening amongst these tourists at the hotel. And then there are deeper flashbacks dealing with the parents of the American character and dealing with the youth of an Algerian character who was also a freedom fighter and who knew the American woman's parents. The bits of dialogue that are set in the French setting are very theatrical. They don't feel like they should be in a novel. They feel like they should be on the stage. And that made for an interesting choice because the opening bit of this is very confusing. It's not straightforward, but rather than being confusing in a frustrating way, it was confusing in a way that made it feel like a challenge. Like, I don't want this book to defeat me, so I need to see what it all means. So even though as I read it, I was not particularly engaged in it, I frankly disliked most of the characters, but I felt like the book was challenging me to find out more about them, and I can't turn down a good challenge. So I was very engaged with it, despite all of that. The further flashback about the American woman's parents was not particularly interesting to me, although I think it was maybe the part with, because in a lot of ways it seemed like it had the least to do with anything else, and the problem with not being particularly interested in the characters as characters as opposed to as shuttles to, you know, solving the challenge of what was actually going on in this meant that that wasn't super interesting to me. However, those flashbacks are coming from stories that are being told by the Algerian woman, who does have her own interesting backstory just before Algerian independence, and her history as a freedom fighter was really interesting. And I think if I were just going in what parts engaged me on a story basis, I would say I would rather read a whole book about her and her backstory than any of the other characters, because most of the other characters were not super likable. It's funny because the English woman, a lot of the other characters complain about her and they don't like her, but really it seems like they don't like each other. And I keep referring to them by their nationality, and they do have names in the book, but I would say at least half, maybe more of the time, they're referred to just as the German man, the Italian woman, and so on. So I feel compelled to keep that going. So I really enjoyed this from a style perspective because it was unusual. And I think that's a reason a lot of people didn't like this, actually, because it is weird stylistically. And I don't think it's entirely successful from that perspective either, but I found that interesting. And I mean, sometimes I would rather read something that's interesting at a meta level rather than good on a sort of, you know, the whole package of style and plot and character and everything else. So I enjoyed the process of reading this more than I enjoyed the novel in the way we would normally think of it. So I don't know, that's a bit of a lukewarm review maybe, but yeah, I enjoyed the process of reading this, and at a meta level I found this super interesting. Characters, not so much, but hey, here's something that's even less than lukewarm. This is Injustice, Gods Among Us, Year 3, Volume 1. That's a lot of subtitles, isn't it? So this is a comic book series that is based on the video games Injustice, Gods Among Us, which is based on the DC Comics universe. So yes, comic based on a game based on a comic. It is not a great story or character piece. It's very much a franchise product in that they get a lot of characters to show up. So rather than any one character getting a lot of attention or plot, it's like a big crossover event. And some people love crossover events. And, you know, if you do, and you like this version of these characters, then you should go out and buy this because it'll be right up your alley. For me, I would rather see people do interesting stories with these set characters than I would have an event book like that. So for me, this was not great. It had some interesting takes, potentially, but because it's mostly an excuse for a variety of characters to show up, the interesting stuff wasn't really engaged with, so it was there and you think, this could have been so much better. Now that said, I loved the art in here. I thought it was fabulous. So I'm not disappointed I read it, just because I really like, and the coloring as well. Because I mean, there are a lot of comics you read and you don't particularly think of, what did the colors add to this? But no, I think yeah. This book is pretty. You know, assuming you like traditional superhero style books. And if so, this is a good looking book. And so I appreciated the look of it, but as a story, not my thing, but I don't think it was designed to be my thing. And it is what it is. So that was a lot of qualified enthusiasm I was giving for those. But I do have one book to talk about that I'm going to be talking about with complete enthusiasm. And that's Hisham Matar's In the Country of Men, which is about a 9-year-old boy in Tripoli in 1979, and his father is involved in some pro-democracy underground movements, and people are being arrested, and neighbors are being interrogated on television, and it's a lot of drama. But this is from the view of a 9-year-old boy. And, you know, kids at that age, like if I think about my 8-year-old nephew, you can see sometimes the adult that he's going to become. But in a lot of ways, he's still a kid. And that's very true of the main character in this book. He's seeing all kinds of major pieces of history, but he just doesn't have the context to interpret them the way an adult would. And some of that is the fault of his parents and the other adults in his life who are withholding information and not telling him the whole story because they want to protect him. But in trying to protect him, they're confusing him, and so he ends up having to come to his own conclusions, which are sometimes not the right ones, and he ends up in situations where he is potentially betraying people in a major way that has major impacts on people's lives. So at some level, it's almost frustrating to read because you want this kid to be older, but he's not. He's a 9-year-old. This is, you know, this is how he's going to think. And I thought that was fantastic. The other thing that I thought was brilliant about this is that the descriptions of place and of weather and of rooms with the window, when drapes are closed or opened, are just fantastic. Like, this was really great. Near the end of the book, we meet the boy as a 20-something who's living in Cairo at that point. And that was less interesting, but it has to end somehow, and that kind of made the most sense, I suppose, because you do want to know what happens to this kid as he grows up, and you get that. But that was maybe the only part that didn't quite match the brilliance of the rest of the book, because the rest of this I just thought was fantastic. Yeah, this was great. I love this. It made me want to go out. I know this author has a memoir as well, and it made me want to go out and read that. Yeah, this was wonderful. And then finally in this period, I read Aristotle and Dante Discover the Secrets of the Universe, which there's a lot of hype about this on BookTube as a whole. I think I would probably describe this book as being delightful. It's not a challenging read. Like, I think I read this, and this is, 360 pages, I think, in the same amount of time as I read this, which is under 200 pages. You can read this in less than 2 hours. It's engaging, it flows nicely, but it's not a challenging read. So if you're expecting that, you'd be disappointed. But this is very much a book that was written about teenagers for teenagers. And I say that not as an insult, because I think this is a spectacular success in that I think there's a real gap for this kind of thing, or has been, for that audience. Because I don't know how many books you see that are about Mexican-American teenage boys falling in love with each other, and also them having these wonderfully engaged parents. I think that was the part that was the biggest takeaway for me, and what surprised me the most, is how charming the parents were. Because I feel like a lot of books that are written for a teenage audience fall into the idea that to empower the children, the adults have to be ineffectual. Even if they're trying to be good parents, they're not, or there has to be drama with the adults. But no, these kids have lovely parents. And at some point, that becomes a little bit ridiculous, because there are a couple of places in this book, especially near the very end, where it kind of crossed the line from not super believable to me. However, that is literally like the second last chapter, I think, maybe third from last. So to complain about something that happened at the very end, I think is not a big negative, because, yeah, this was charming. Is this the best thing I've ever read? No. But does it fill a definite gap in the market for this style of book? Absolutely. And I love that exists. I was charmed. All right, it's weirdly getting dark now, so I guess it's gonna rain. So that was that. It was, despite the fact that I was kind of on the fence about a few of those, I actually really enjoyed everything that I read these past 10 days, so good 10 days. If you read any of these, let's chat about it. All right, that's it. Ciao.